Richard Wilbur, an American poet and translator whose precise, rhythmic verse, employing classical forms in an era when experimental works in free-flowing confessionals reigned supreme, earned him 2 Pulitzer Prizes and a reputation as one of the greatest poets of the 20th century, died October 14 at a nursing home in Belmont, Mass. He was 96. The cause was not immediately known, said a son, Chris Wilbur. Mr. Wilbur, a former Army infantryman who devoted himself to poetry after returning from World War II, was among the most prolific poets of his generation. A devotee of classical rhyme and meter, his work retained a sense of orderly elegance through the rise of confessional poets such as Robert Lowell and Sylvia Plath, and in contrast to the often esoteric work of avant-garde writers like John Ashbery, who died last month at aged 90. If Ashbery invented a whole new kind of poetry, said Robert Casper, head of the Library of Congress's Poetry and Literature Center, Richard Wilbur reminded us of the enduring power of tradition, that poems about the natural world and about love, written in classical traditional rhyme and meter, would continue to matter going forward into the future. In an email, the Irish poet Paul Muldoon described Mr. Wilbur as the single greatest technician in American poetry of the last 70 years, adding, "It was a technique perfectly at the service of tenderness and terror." Mr. Wilbur published his first book, The Beautiful Changes and Other Poems, in 1947, rendering his war experiences in a formal style that some critics derided as overly ornate and borderline baroque. Within a decade, however, he had refined his voice, stripping away some of its poetic excesses. He won his first Pulitzer Prize in 1957 for Things of This World, which drew its title from one of Mr. Wilbur's most widely anthologized poems. It was one of many poems that demonstrated Mr. Wilbur's deep-rooted belief that the universe was, as he put it in a 1977 interview with the Paris Review, full of glorious energy. And that the ultimate character of things is comely and good. "My feeling," he continued, "is that when you discover order and goodness in the world, it is not something you are imposing, it is something that is likely really to be there, whatever crumminess and evil and disorder there may also be. I don't take disorder or meaninglessness to be the basic character of things." In a sign of Mr. Wilbur's stature in American poetry, he was appointed the second U.S. Poet Laureate, following Robert Penn Warren, in 1987. The Library of Congress had previously named consultants in poetry. 2 years later, he received his second Pulitzer Prize for new and collected poems. His work extended well beyond that of sonnets and sapphics, to include acclaimed translations of the French playwrights Molière and Racine, and the poets Baudelaire and Brodsky. He contributed lyrics to Leonard Bernstein's 1956 operetta Candide, and, inspired by the births of his 4 children, even dabbled in children's books, writing whimsical verses, "What is the opposite of soup? It's nuts," and books of pun-filled wordplay, including Opposites, a 1973 picture book that he illustrated himself.